In the last lecture, I was talking about chapters 1 and 2 of Reading the Gospels Wisely, and I mentioned that there is the reality that most of the things I want to say are already in the book, and then I just kind of gave a brief overview of that. But there are a few other things we could say, and so in this short time, what I want to do is kind of give you 4 descriptions of the Gospels that have some overlap with some of the things that are in the book, but are also some things I didn't say explicitly. And so what I want to give you here is I just call this various descriptions of the Gospel narratives that are just 4 kind of other 4 or 5 points of contact or ways of viewing what are going on in the Gospels. Again, some of which overlap, but not all of this. So the first one to say is that the Gospels are encyclical narratives. Encyclical narratives. And what that means is, and this relates to a big scholarly discussion over the last 100 years or so, and that is this, that for a long time now in scholarly analysis of the Gospels, there's been an emphasis on the fact that the Gospels are written for particular communities, both from and to particular communities. It's gotten the most traction, especially when you talk about the Gospel of John and the Johannine community. Certain scholars in the mid-20th century really emphasized this, but it's true for Matthew as well. And there became a trend of seeing the Gospels as really localized. And what it does, it comes from and kind of contributes to this idea that there are different versions of Christianity in the early church and ones that are often in competition with each other. So Paul versus Matthew, and James versus Paul maybe, and maybe Matthew versus Mark, or Matthew versus Luke. These are not things, of course, I adhere to, but I'm just saying that in the scholarly discussion of the Gospels, this has been a big part of that idea. The assertion that the Gospels are instead encyclical narratives is going precisely against that whole sort of apparatus. And what it means is that the Gospels are narratives that were meant to be circulated widely. So while it's true, of course, that each of the evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as historical people, of course, lived in and worked in a certain city and area probably. They probably traveled some, but certainly they live and worship in a certain community. Even though that's true, the argument is that when they are writing a gospel, they are not thinking this is just my localized version of Christianity in competition with another. Yes, they think they have a voice to share, but they see themselves as part of a much larger early Christian movement, or followers of Jesus, or Christianoi, or all the members of the way, all the different ways they were described. And this argument has been so well made by my PhD supervisor, Richard Bauckham, in a book he did many years ago now, he edited, called The Gospels for All Christians, and I'd highly recommend it. It's a great book. And he argues very clearly, and many other authors do as well, that all the evidence of the first century world is that there was a lot of interaction going on, that there weren't just these isolated communities, but that each of the Gospels are written for wide circulation. So that's the first thing just to point out, because you'll run into that a lot in your reading of Gospels, especially if you get deeper into it, that the Gospels are written for local communities rather than for all Christians. And so one of the implications of that is that you'll often hear people talk about Matthew's the most Jewish of the Gospels or something. That may still be true in some sense, and there's nothing wrong with that way of saying it, but a lot of times that kind of view is taken farther to kind of view the Gospels as very unique from each other. And what this point is, the encyclical narratives point, is that the Gospels are interacting with each other, Christians are interacting with each other, there's a lot of orthodox interaction happening, and the Gospels are meant to be widely circulated. More briefly, a few other things to say about the nature of the Gospels. Second is that they are theology historicized and history theologized. Now, this is something I'll be talking about throughout the class, but just to say it here as a point as well, that those seem like opposites. History is what happened, theology is kind of the reflections on it, but a big part of what I'm going to be arguing in this class, and I do argue in the book, is that those two categories shouldn't be seen as separate. I mean, they have some ways in which they're different, but we should recognize that all history writing is coming from an agenda and has a point. It's not just sort of this objective, non-pastoral or non-theological agenda, and that's not a bad thing. That's, in fact, inevitable, and that's a good thing. And the point of this is just to embrace the Gospels as both historical accounts and theological accounts simultaneously, not seeing those as ultimately separate, but seeing them as doing both together. So that's something I kind of talk about in other ways in the book, but just to state it as a point. Another descriptor of the Gospels is that they can be helpfully thought of as portraiture. And again, this is something that kind of comes across in other parts of the book as well. But to say it this way, and this is based on Richard Burridge's excellent book on the four Gospels, and that is, if you think about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's helpful to think of them as like four different paintings or four different images or portraits of the same person. And Burridge gives the example of Winston Churchill. That you could look at different examples of pictures of Winston Churchill, one being of him that we very commonly see of like the grim, determined statesman in a dark suit, cigar in hand, at the famous conference with President Roosevelt during the uncertain days of World War II. That'd be one portrait of Churchill. Another would be a painting of Churchill from 1927, one that actually, so much before World War II, in his house in Chartwell. It's called Tea Time at Chartwell in 1927. He's casually dressed, he's smiling, he's not bearing the cares of the world, he's seated around the table for a family meal. Still the same person, a very different portrayal of him. You could go along the corridor in Churchill's house and find another famous picture of Churchill at war, dressed in a uniform, sitting in a camouflaged car surrounded by uniformed men and giving his famous V for victory with a cigar there as well. Another slightly different vision of Churchill, of the same person. And then finally, a fourth picture is a photo that was taken, so not a portrait in the sense of painting, but a photo that was taken of Churchill unaware as he rests on a post-war holiday in Switzerland. He's got a white painter's jacket on, he has a palette in his hand, a brush in the other, still a cigar in his mouth, and he's doing a painting. The point is, each of these describe the same person, but they depict him in a very different way. And it's just a helpful basic idea of thinking about what's going on in the Gospels, is that there's a lot of overlap, and they all are clearly talking about Jesus, but they all are also portraying him in a certain way for a certain purpose and revealing something about him that the others don't. And so that's just a really helpful sort of concept, another way to get at what the four Gospels are giving us. A fourth descriptor of the Gospels is that they are like stained glass windows, another helpful description. And this image gives the opportunity to talk more specifically about the historical witness they provide, something that I talk about in the book as well. But just particularly the idea that each of the Gospels, again, are giving us a certain refraction, a certain stained glass kind of picture of who Jesus is and was and what he did. And again, that doesn't mean they're in conflict with each other, but it means we can embrace them as different at the same time, and recognizing that as the light shines through them, and maybe in different ways, they depict Jesus in a certain way, and that all history retelling entails a kind of depiction with selection and deselection, something I ended up talking about in the book as well. And the fifth and final, I said four at the beginning, they're actually five. The fifth and final descriptor of the Gospels that I want to give you is that they are eyewitness testimony. Yet again, this is something I ended up talking about in the book when I talk about history, but just the idea here again to recognize that what we have in the Gospels is not history in this sort of uninterested sense, but it's history in the sense that people who are invested in it, who witness these events, are proclaiming something to us. They're telling us something. They're teaching something to us. It's always good to remember that by the time we have the Gospels written, for Mark, but especially for Matthew, Luke, and John, there's a lot of time that has passed, a lot of reflection of what has happened at Easter and at Pentecost, a lot of pastoral situations, a lot of preaching and teaching, a lot of spiritual revelation about how to read the Jewish Scriptures anew in light of Christ. All of that has happened. And so when we get the Gospels, we are getting people who care about history, but care about history because they are personally involved in it. They are eyewitnesses who have a testimony, who are witnessing and teaching us through the gospel accounts. And so that's a helpful descriptor again. And in a lot of ways, all these things I'm saying are things we're going to kind of come in and out of throughout the class and have already been mentioned in the book. But these are descriptors that help us get at, again, how to understand what the Gospels are.